Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another season preview video. In today's video, we're looking at the two New York teams, our second Metro Division season preview video. I was looking at the two New York teams, looking at how they did this past offseason, how they did last year, and looking at how they're gearing up going into this upcoming season. We'll get to both these teams and how they did coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to with all of you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so if you haven't already, please subscribe or like support the channel. Don't forget to stay tuned for more videos coming out in the very near future. So as per usual, once again, we have another season preview video. We've done a handful of these up to this point so far. So we're going to start off this week with New York's season preview video. So we're gonna look at the Rangers and the Islanders as per usual. Look at how they did last year, how they did the offseason, adding and subtracting their big trades. We'll look at the top 3 draft picks they had from this past season. I'll go through my offseason checklist for my offseason preview video, see what they accomplished. We'll also look at my projected lineup, my projected point total for these two teams, and we'll look at their offseason grades. So we'll start with the New York Rangers. Last year was a bad season for them. They had a really solid start, but tailed off and missed the playoffs by only 6 points, but they did wind up missing the playoffs. A year after, they wound up making it to the Eastern Conference Final, had a record of 39, 36, and 7 for 85 points. That was good enough for 5th in the Metro Division, but 11th in the Eastern Conference and 22nd in the entire NHL. So very interesting note there, but the Rangers, it was just not a good season for them. Didn't even hit the 40 win mark, so really bad stuff there for the Rangers. They actually had 255 goals for and 255 goals against. So they were an even rating in the plus-minus category. So once again, it's not the best we've seen. They're not plus a whole bunch like Tampa or Vegas are, but it's not a whole bunch minus either, like teams like San Jose and Chicago have been. So once again, it's not the worst in the world, but it's not the best either, and they could have had probably a little bit better defense and probably a tiny bit better offense. Goal scoring and point scoring wise in the regular season for the New York Rangers, Panarin led the team with 89 points, followed by Zibanejad with 62 and Fox with 61, while Panarin led the team with 37 goals, Trocheck had 26, and Kreider had 22. So only one guy had 30 plus goals, only one guy had 70 plus points. So once again, you can see how they were one of the lower teams when it comes to the goal scoring side, but still, I mean, if they can get some more players hitting the 30 goal mark or the 60 plus point mark, like that would be really good. So very interesting note there. Once again, this team missed the playoffs, so there are no playoff stats to go off of for the New York Rangers. Next, going over to their offseason additions and subtractions. So if you look at this addition and subtractions, it's very, very intriguing. They added Justin Dowling from New Jersey, Taylor Raddysh from Washington, both in free agency, Carey Terrence from Anaheim in a trade, Trey Fix-Wolansky from Columbus, Vladislav Gavrikov from LA, both in free agency, Scott Morrow from Carolina in a trade, and then they also got the Maple Leafs 2025 third round pick, the Dallas Stars 2026 first round pick, and the Carolina Hurricanes 2026 second round picks in trades. So very interesting note there. Well, they lost Chris Kreider to Anaheim in a trade. They lost Nicholas Bell in free agency to Minnesota, Lestigens to Buffalo, Giroux to Toronto, Kaliev to Ottawa, all in free agency. They lost Kreider and Miller in a trade to Carolina. They lost Zach Jones to Buffalo, Calvin DeHaan, who's UFA, and Louis Domingue, who's UFA, all in free agency. And they lost a 2025 fourth round pick of the Anaheim Ducks in a trade. So very interesting note there. Like, if you look at this team, you break it all down offensively. Terrence, I think eventually in a couple of years' time could be a really solid forward prospect there for the New York Rangers. Probably won't be this year. And then they add some depth pieces who could probably round out the fourth line, be call-up options in Dowling, Raddysh, and Fix-Wolansky. But they did lose quite a bit of depth on the forward group. They lost Bell, Lestigens, Giroux, Kaliev. But the biggest one was Chris Kreider. Like, you lose him and you don't really replace him in the top 6. That's going to be a massive loss there for the New York Rangers. Defensively, they add Gavrikov and Morrow, and they lose Miller, Jones, and DeHaan. So once again, it's not overly bad. Like, I think Gavrikov is going to be a really good fit in the Rangers organization. Morrow can probably play on the third pair. Maybe lose a tiny bit of depth, but I think their defense might have actually gone a little bit better from where it entered the offseason. Goaltending-wise, lose a little bit of depth by not bringing back Louis Domingue, who's been a solid third stringer the past couple of seasons. But they do also get a couple of really solid draft picks they could use at a future date to make some very interesting moves. So all in all, not a bad offseason. Like, I do think they lost a little bit of depth. Maybe got little bit worse on the forward group, but it could have been a lot worse for the New York Rangers. So those are additions and subtractions. The New York Rangers made 2 trades this offseason up to this point. They traded Chris Kreider and the Ducks 2025 4th round pick to the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for the Leafs 2025 3rd round pick, as well as Carey Terrence. And then they also acquired Scott Morrow, the Stars 2026 1st round pick, and the Hurricanes 2026 2nd round pick from the Carolina Hurricanes in exchange for Kreider Miller. So all in all, those were some very interesting trades there from the New York Rangers. Next, going over to the top 3 draft picks for the Rangers for a 2025 draft. So at this current point in time, they had 3 draft picks. Their first draft pick of the 2025 draft was in the 2nd round. They took left winger Malcolm Spence, 43rd overall. That was a really solid pickup here because I thought Spence was going to be a late 1st round. So again, in the early parts of the 2nd round, that was a pretty good pickup there for the Rangers. Their next pick was in the 3rd round, 70th overall. They took right shot defenseman Barnhill, and then they had another 3rd round pick, 89th overall, and they took left shot defenseman Gonchar. So they took a couple of defensive prospects who I think eventually could be challenging for like 3rd, maybe 2nd pair roles in a couple of years' time. So very interesting note there. But the Rangers, I think, did pretty well with the few draft picks that they had this past draft by taking Spence, who's going to be a solid top 9 forward going forward, and then a couple of solid defensive prospects later on in the 3rd round. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to my off-season checklist that I had in the off-season preview video. So back in the off-season preview video, I had a checklist of 5 things I said the New York Rangers team should do in the off-season to get better and maybe make a more competitive team next year. The first thing I said was to move Kreider. They did that. The Rangers were able to accomplish one of my top priorities for them, which was to move Chris Kreider. The Kreider distraction was evident last year. Kreider was mentioned around Christmas time or maybe just a little bit before as being a guy who the Rangers were shopping. Never got traded before the trade deadline, so he stayed with the Rangers. It seemed to be a big distraction last year with Trouba and Kreider being mentioned as trade chips, but never really getting dealt. Trouba eventually did. So I said that this team had to move on from Chris Kreider, even though he's a former 50 goal scorer and a really solid top 6 forward, and they did. Like, the return wasn't overly great. Terrence, maybe he can be a solid pickup here. They got a 3rd round pick, so like I said, it wasn't the greatest of packages, but at least they were able to move off of Chris Kreider, so that was my top priority. The second thing for this team to do was to add a top 4 defenseman, and they did that because they signed Vladislav Gavrikov, one of the top UFA defensemen in free agency. So once again, I think that's a really good pickup here. I think Gavrikov, whether he plays on the 2nd pair or maybe on the 1st pair with a guy like Adam Fox, is going to be a really solid defensive-minded shutdown defenseman. The contract you could, I guess, say is a little bit hefty, but I definitely do think that that's a really solid pickup there for the Rangers. So I'm going to give them a check mark on that one. They completed one of my top priorities for them. The third thing I said this team should do is to let Othman and Perreault play in the top 9. I feel like those two guys are going to get really solid opportunities to play in the top 9. I think Perreault is going to be a really solid top 6 forward this upcoming season, maybe replacing a guy like Chris Kreider. And I think Othman should also have a shot to play in the top 9 with not too many new players coming in via free agency. So I think to some extent they did accomplish that. The fourth thing I said in my offseason preview video that they should do was to add a top 6 winger. They unfortunately, at least at this point in time, have not done that. So they're going into the season without having replaced Chris Kreider. Maybe they're hoping guys like Perreault and Othman internally can maybe replace Chris Kreider, but I was really hoping that they would add one more top 6 forward to maybe sort of round out the top 6. Didn't do that, so that's something that I put on my checklist that they did not accomplish. And the fifth thing that I said this team should do in my offseason checklist was move or sign Kreider Miller. And they did that. They did wind up moving Kreider Miller. His ask was way too high for that New York Rangers team, so he moved from the Carolina, and he's going to get a fresh start there. So very interesting note there, but they did complete at least 3, maybe even 4 things on my offseason checklist thing. The only thing they didn't really do was to add a top 6 forward, which is something I'm a little bit disappointed in, but very interesting note there. Next, going over to New York Rangers lineup for the 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, I project the lineup for the Rangers for this upcoming season is as follows. The top line will be JT Miller playing with Mika Zibanejad and Jacob Perreault. The second line would be Panarin with Trocheck and Lafreniere. The third line would be Cooley with Parson and Othman, and the fourth one will be Edstrom with Carrick and Raddysh. Gavrikov and Fox will be the top pair. Vanakainen and Schneider will be a second pair. Borgen and Morrow will be a third pair. You'd have Shesterkin being the starter, Quick being the backup, Rempe, Brodzinski, and Susti being the 3 spares. And that would be a decent roster there for the Rangers. Nowhere near as deep as it was last year, but it's an alright roster there for New York. Next, going over to my predictions for the New York Rangers for this upcoming 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, I don't really see the Rangers being an overly great team. Like, I think they're going to be challenging for a playoff spot. Wouldn't be surprised if they somehow snuck into a playoff spot, but at this current point in time, I really can't see them being a playoff team. So my current prediction for the New York Rangers is as follows. I have them finishing with a record of 43, 34, and 5 for 91 points, 9th in the Eastern Conference, the closest team to a playoff spot who does not make the playoffs. So I think they're going to be ever so slightly close to a playoff berth. I wouldn't be surprised if they snuck into a wildcard spot, maybe a top 3 spot in the Metro Division, but at this current point in time, I just don't think they did enough this past offseason to rectify getting back into the playoffs after missing this past year. So that's where I have the Rangers at this current point in time. Just ever so slightly in my predictions, missing out on a playoff spot, but hitting the 90 plus point total and 40 plus wins. So very interesting note there. And lastly, going over to my offseason grade for the New York Rangers. So as it's right now, after the offseason they had, all the 4 losses that they had, especially with Kreider, the defensive shakeup, losing Louis Domingue, and those draft picks, I think they had a decent offseason, but I can't say it's one of the best we've seen in recent memory. So I'm going to give them a C plus offseason grade. Like, I think they had a little bit of a above average offseason. I just can't say with the lack of forward help or with the change-ups in the defensive end, they got a whole bunch better. So at this current point in time, I'm going to give them a C plus rating. I think that's warranted for the Rangers are right now. So that's my thoughts on the New York Rangers. Next, going over to the New York Islanders. So going over to New York Islanders, the last year was not an overly great season for the Islanders. They hung around in the playoff race for quite some time last year, but at the end of it, they did finish almost 10 points out of a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. They had a record of 35, 35, and 12 for 82 points. 6th in the Metro Division, 12th in the Eastern Conference, and 23rd in the NHL. So it wasn't a great season there for the Islanders. It was literally average. They had a 500 record. So once again, it wasn't close to a playoff spot. They needed to be better, but it wasn't one of the worst records we've seen in the league. So very interesting note there. They wound up scoring 222 goals and giving up 257 goals against. So they were a minus 35 during the regular season. Once again, it's not one of the worst we've seen in the entire NHL, although it is close to it. And once again, goal scoring wise, need to be better, and they could have done with a little bit more defensive help. So very interesting note there, but goal scoring defensive wise in the regular season last year just wasn't really good for the Islanders. Goal scoring and point scoring wise in the regular season, Horvat led the team with 57 points, followed by Lee, who had 54, and Palmieri, who had 48. And then Lee led the team with 29 goals, followed by Horvat, who had 28, and Palmieri, who had 24. So once again, Lee, Horvat, Palmieri were the driving forces this year on the offensive side, which says something given the fact no one hit the 30-goal mark, no one hit the 60-point plateau. So you can see why they were one of the lower teams in the goal-scoring side. So very interesting note there. And the Islanders missed the playoffs last year, so there's no playoff stats to go off of for the New York Islanders. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to their additions and subtractions from this past offseason. It's not one of the longest lists we've seen. Addition-wise, they added Jonathan Drouin from Colorado in free agency, Emil Heineman from Montreal in a trade, Shabanov, which was one of the top KHL prospects, Matthew Highmore from Ottawa, Ethan Bear from Washington, David Rick from Los Angeles, all in free agency. And then they added 2 first-round picks in the 2025 draft, one from Montreal, one from Calgary as part of the Noah Dobson deal. So those are all their additions. While they lost Dobson and Fasching to CBJ, Tyce Thompson to UFA status, Scott Peronovich to Utah, all in free agency, trade Noah Dobson to Montreal, lost Samuel Bolduc to Los Angeles, Mike Riley to Carolina, Grant Hudson as a UFA, and Jacob Skerrick to San Jose, all also as UFA. So once again, it wasn't the greatest of off seasons, and they only made, I think, 1 trade. But if you look at this team, offensive-wise, a little bit better. You had Heineman, who had a pretty good rookie season last year, Drouin, who can be a solid top 9, top 6 forward, Shabanov, who looks like he's a promising KHL prospect to replace losses of Hudson Fasching and Tyce Thompson. Like, that's a really solid improvement on the forward group. Defensive-wise, it took a big hit. Like, losing Noah Dobson is going to be a massive blow to that team. Even lost some depth by losing Bolduc, Riley, and Hutton, and only adding Bear to replace them. So very interesting note there. Add Bradick to replace Skerrick as the 3rd stringer on the team, which I think is a really solid move there from the Islanders. And they got a couple of first-round picks. So once again, it wasn't the worst offseason we've seen in the world, but it wasn't one of the best ones either. And I do think defensive-wise, they're going to take a little bit of a step back this upcoming season. So very interesting note there. The Islanders also had 1 trade this past offseason. That was a Dobson deal, trading Dobson to Montreal for Emil Heineman, a 2025 first-round pick, and another 2025 first-round pick, which is, I think, a win-win deal for both sides. But I think that was a really solid move there from the Islanders to move off off of Noah Dobson. Next, going over to the top 3 picks in the 2025 draft for the New York Islanders. So their first pick was the first overall pick. So they had won the draft lottery. They had the first overall selection. And with the first overall selection, they took left shot defenseman Matthew Schaefer. So once again, one of the consensus top picks later on into the season. Schaefer winds up going first overall to the Islanders, which really strengthens their blue line and makes the Dobson deal a little more palatable. I think eventually he should be a top pair defenseman there for the Islanders. Then because of the Dobson deal, they had 2 other first round picks. That was 16th and 17th overall from the Montreal Canadiens. And they used those 2 picks to take left winger Victor Eklund and left shot defenseman Kashan Aitchison. So Aitchison, I think, eventually is going to be a solid second pair. Maybe could challenge for first pair defenseman in the New York Islanders organization. And Eklund's going to be a really solid top 6 goal scoring winger. So all in all, they had 3 top 20 draft picks in this past 2025 draft. And I think they hit home on basically all of them. So some really good moves there from the Islanders, taking Schaefer, Eklund, and Aitchison with their first 3 picks in the 2025 draft. Next, going over to my offseason checklist from the offseason preview video. So as usual, 5 things I mentioned in the offseason preview I said this team should do in the offseason to get better and improve on next year. Now, first thing I said this team should do was to extend Noah Dobson, Simone Holmstrom, Kyle Palmieri, and Tony DeAngelo. Noah Dobson they traded, so that wasn't an extension, but I think they accomplished that because Holmstrom was extended on a 2-year deal, Palmieri was extended on a 2-year deal, and DeAngelo got a 1-year extension. So like all in all, I think they did some really good things bringing back those 3 players, and they didn't lose Dobson, they traded him. So like I said, I think those were some very interesting pieces there from the Islanders, but I think signing Holmstrom, Palmieri, DeAngelo, who were all pretty big pieces towards the end of the last year for the New York Islanders, were smart moves there from the Islanders. The second thing I said this team should do was to get a top 6 winger. Now, you could say maybe they did that or maybe they didn't. It depends on your views with Jonathan Drouin. Is Drouin a top 6 forward? If they did, then they completed that thing that was on my checklist, and then you can give that check because they completed it. But if they didn't, and if you view Drouin as more of like a third liner, especially on the Islanders, then they really didn't complete that one. So that really is based on the point of view of where you think Drouin will fit in the New York Islanders organization. But I guess you could say to some extent they might have accomplished that, so very interesting note there. The third thing that this team should do in the offseason was to consider moving one of or both of Pageau or Anders Lee. And they didn't do either of them. Lee is still on the team, Pageau is still on the team. Pageau, I think, is entering the final year of his deal. Lee has 2 years left. So they could still move off of them, especially closer to trade deadline, but it looks like leading up to training camp, potentially going into the start of the season, they're going to have both those guys on the roster. So unfortunately, they didn't move either one of them, which is something I thought this team should desperately do. The fourth thing I said this team should do in the offseason checklist was to give younger guys like Maggio, Ritchie, and George a look. I think they will be able to do that. They did lose a little bit of depth, especially on the defensive end. So younger guys like Odelius and George on the defensive end are definitely going to have shots to make the NHL roster, as well as Schaefer. And then on top of that, guys like Maggio, Ritchie are going to have shots to make on the forward group. There's even some mention that Ritchie's going to have a legit shot to make the NHL roster. So very interesting note there, but I do think they accomplished that by having some spots open for the Islanders to have some of the younger players play. And then the fifth thing I said this team should do is to add some bottom 6 help. Now in the offseason preview video, I mentioned Donov, Armia, Beauvillier, and Bukes as potential options the Islanders could go after, but I definitely think they accomplished this by adding guys like Drouin and Heineman. Like, if Drouin isn't a top 6 forward, he's definitely a bottom 6 forward, and adding some bottom 6 veteran help is smart there, and Heineman can also fill a bottom 6 role, so I definitely think they added some bottom 6 help this past offseason. So all in all, if you look at the offseason checklist, they really completed 3 or maybe even 4 of my offseason checklist stuff. The only thing they really didn't accomplish was moving one of Pageau or Lee, which I still think they probably should have done. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to my projected lineup for the New York Islanders for 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, here's my lineup. On the top line, we have Simone Holmstrom playing with Bo Horvat and Matthew Barzal. The second line is Drouin with Pageau and Saiplikov. The third line is Duclair with Ritchie and Shabanov. And the fourth line is Palmieri with Cizikas and Lee. Defensively, you have Pelican Pulak, Romanov and DeAngelo, Schaefer and Mayfield. You have Sorokin being the starter, Riddick being the backup, McLean, Heineman, Boqvist being the 3 spares, and Varlamov starting on either injury reserve or long-term injury reserve. And that will be a decent roster. The forward group is deep. Defensively, it's probably a little bit worse than last year. Goaltending-wise, Varlamov's going to be a big question mark, but still, I think this is an all-in-all decent roster there for the New York Islanders. Next, going over to my prediction for the New York Islanders for this upcoming 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, I don't think the Islanders are going to be doing a whole bunch better than last year. If anything, maybe a little bit worse. Like, I know that their forward group looks a little bit better. They're probably going to score a couple more goals. Defensive-wise, maybe a little bit worse. first really does depend on how Sorokin plays, but I just think they're not going to be an overly great team. They're going to sell the deadline, maybe tank after that. So I have them finishing with a record of 34, 42, and 6 for 74 points, 15th in the Eastern Conference. So that's a low rating I'm giving the New York Islanders. Like, I have them being one of the bottom 2 teams in the Eastern Conference, which isn't overly good. Now, once again, the Islanders have a good enough forward group, and if Sorokin goes on a run, they could be a little bit closer to the 500 mark, maybe challenge for a playoff spot, but as current point in time, I just can't see that happening. So that's my current predictions for the New York Islanders for this upcoming season, one of the lowest teams in the Eastern Conference. And lastly, going over to their offseason grade. So if you look at this team, like I think the Dobson deal was smart, given what they got for him, but it's going to be a big loss on the back end. They add some solid forward help, defensive-wise, maybe a little bit worse. Goaltending-wise, a little bit better with Riddick. So all in all, like, I don't think they had a bad offseason, but I can't really say they got a whole bunch better than last year. So I'm going to give them, just like the Rangers, a C+ rating. I think they had a little bit above average of an offseason. I just can't say they had a great offseason. That's why I'm giving them a C+ rating for their offseason. So that's my opinion on the New York Islanders and New York Rangers as current point in time. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Do you think the Islanders are poised to take a major step back, a couple of points to finish one of the lowest teams in the Eastern Conference? Are the Rangers a team who's going to finish ever so close to a playoff spot and just miss out? Definitely want to hear your thoughts on both those things, and if you agree or disagree with them, down in the comment section below. That's all I'm going to talk for today. If you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to without all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for more videos coming out in the very near future. Also a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis. That's where you check that out. I'll link that in the description below. Can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.